May 8, 1945. Bavaria. The morning mist clings to the pine forests like a shroud reluctant to lift. In a muddy clearing near the ruined village of Berchtesgaden, a man in a tattered black uniform kneels in the damp grass. His boots are caked with dried blood, not his own. His hands, bound behind his back with coarse rope, tremble slightly. Not from cold, from silence. For 6 years, Europe roared. Now, only birdsong and the crunch of American boots on gravel break the stillness. A U.S. Army sergeant steps forward, rifle slung, eyes narrowed. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need. 2. The insignia on the prisoner's collar. 2 lightning runes says everything. SS. Nearby, a column of liberated slave laborers shuffles past, hollow-eyed, skeletal. One spits. Another stares with a hatred so deep it seems to swallow sound itself. The SS man lowers his head. Not in shame, perhaps in calculation. Or fear. Just weeks earlier, he might have ordered this very road cleared by execution. Now, he is the one being cleared away discarded like the regime he served. The war is over. But for men like him, a different kind of battle has just begun. Survival in a world that no longer sees them as soldiers, but as symbols of unspeakable evil. And justice, when it comes, will not always wear a uniform. To understand the fate of SS prisoners in 1945, one must first trace the origins of the organization that made their capture so fraught with moral and legal consequence. The Schutzstaffel did not begin as the engine of genocide. It began as something far more intimate. A personal guard for Adolf Hitler died in 1925, just 2 years after the failed beer hall putsch. Hitler ordered the formation of a small, loyal bodyguard unit. Drawn from the ranks of the Sturmabteilung, say, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, this new formation was meant to be elite, disciplined and unwavering in its devotion. By 1929, Heinrich Himmler, a quiet, fastidious former chicken farmer, with a passion for mysticism and racial theory, was appointed its leader. Under him, the SS would mutate from a ceremonial escort into the central nervous system of terror in the Third Reich. Himmler envisioned the SS not merely as enforcers, but as a new aristocracy, a racial elite destined to rule over a purified Europe. Membership required proof of Aryan ancestry dating back to 1750. Candidates underwent rigorous physical and ideological screening. Loyalty to Hitler was non-negotiable. And obedience, absolute. By the mid-1930s, the SS had already eclipsed the SA in power. The night of the Long Knives in June 1934, when Hitler purged SA, leadership cemented the SS as the regime's primary instrument of internal security. Himmler, now also head of the German police, merged state and party terror apparatuses under his control. The Gestapo secret state police, the Kripo, criminal police, and later the SD, Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, all fell under the umbrella of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, led by Reinhard Heydrich. But the SS's most sinister expansion came with the concentration camp system. In 1933, the first camps Dachau, Oranienburg, were established to imprison political opponents. By 1934, Himmler placed them under SS control, appointing Theodor Eicke as inspector of concentration camps. Eicke, a fanatical disciplinarian, codified a regime of brutality, beatings, torture, arbitrary executions. He taught his guards the prisoners were enemies of the state, undeserving of human consideration. This mindset would metastasize across occupied Europe. Yet the SS was not only an instrument of repression. In 1939, as war loomed, Himmler authorized the formation of armed SS units, the Verfügungstruppe, which would evolve into the Waffen-SS. Initially small, These combat formations grew rapidly during the war, eventually fielding over 38 divisions and nearly 900,000 men by 1945. Though technically part of the German armed forces, the Waffen-SS remained ideologically distinct, fanatically loyal, racially indoctrinated, and often implicated in atrocities, even on the front lines. The SS's reach extended beyond the battlefield. Through these S-Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptschluss, WVHA, under Oswald Pohl, it ran a vast economic empire: slave labor factories, quarries, armaments plants, built on the backs of concentration camp inmates. Auschwitz alone employed tens of thousands. In its industrial complex, the SS extracted gold fillings from corpses, sorted victims' clothing, and auctioned human hair. Profit and extermination were not separate goals. They were symbiotic. By 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the SS assumed its most horrific role, executor of the final solution. 4 Einsatzgruppenmobile killing squads composed of SS and police followed the Wehrmacht into the east. Their mission: eliminate Jews, communists, and other undesirables. In ravines like Babi Yar, over 33,000 Jews were shot in 2 days. By 1943, these units had murdered over 1 million people, mostly by gunfire. The shift to industrialized killing came with the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. There, senior SS and state officials, including Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, coordinated the logistics of genocide. Extermination camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and later Auschwitz-Birkenau were constructed with chilling efficiency. Zyklon B gas, sealed chambers, crematoria, all managed by SS personnel who signed off on death like accountants balancing ledgers. Crucially, the SS was never just a military or police force. It was a parallel state. It had its own courts, schools, settlement programs, like the doomed Germanic colonies in occupied Poland, and even its own religious-like rituals. Himmler spoke of the SS as a knightly order, bound by honor and blood. This self-mythologizing insulated its members from moral doubt. To be SS was not to follow orders. It was to embody the will of the Führer, and that identity would prove fatal in 1945. When Germany surrendered, the Allies did not view the SS as soldiers caught in the tides of war. They saw them as architects of a criminal enterprise. Unlike regular Wehrmacht troops, who were often granted prisoner of war status under the Geneva Conventions, SS members were presumed guilty. Their black uniforms were not just military attire. They were the garb of executioners. This presumption would shape everything that followed, from the moment of capture to interrogation, trial, and, for many, execution. But to grasp why the collapse of the Third Reich unleashed such targeted fury upon the SS, one must examine not just what the SS had done, but how the war itself had ended. In total disintegration, moral reckoning, and a world demanding answers. By April 1945, the Third Reich was not merely losing the war, it was ceasing to exist as a coherent state. Berlin lay encircled by Soviet forces, its streets cratered by artillery, its government bunkers filled with the stench of fear and cyanide. Adolf Hitler, refusing evacuation, remained in the Vorbunker beneath the Chancellery Garden, issuing delusional orders to phantom armies while Soviet shells shook the walls above. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler shot himself. His body, wrapped in a blanket and doused in gasoline, was burned in a shallow shell hole outside the bunker, a crude end for the man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich. Hours before his death, he named Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. Dönitz, a naval officer with no political experience, established a short-lived rump government in Flensburg, near the Danish border. His primary mission was not to continue the war, but to negotiate an orderly surrender to the Western Allies. While delaying Soviet advances, the surrender came swiftly. On May 7th, German representatives signed an unconditional instrument of surrender at General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France. It took effect the following day, May 8th at 11:01 p.m. Central European Time. The war in Europe was over. The peace did not mean stability. Across Germany and occupied Europe, chaos reigned. Millions of displaced persons, former concentration camp inmates, forced laborers, refugees roamed roads once patrolled by SS patrols. Cities lay in ruins. Governments had collapsed. And into this vacuum stepped the victors: the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, each occupying a zone, each with different priorities, yet united on one point: Nazi leadership must be held accountable. This consensus crystallized at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. There, the Allies declared that the entire Nazi leadership, including the SS, must be dismantled. Crucially, they distinguished between ordinary German soldiers and members of criminal organizations. The SS, along with the Gestapo and the SD, was explicitly labeled a criminal organization in what would become Article 10 of the London Charter, the legal foundation for the Nuremberg trials. This label carried profound consequences. Under international law as it stood in 1945, combatants captured in uniform were entitled to prisoner of war status, including protections against punishment for lawful acts of war. But if an organization was deemed criminal as a whole, then mere membership could be grounds for prosecution, regardless of individual actions. The Allies had precedent for this stance. As early as 1943, the Moscow Declarations had warned that those responsible for atrocities would be sent back to the countries where their abominable deeds were done, to face justice. In 1944, the United Nations War Crimes Commission began compiling lists of suspects. By war's end, the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, carried blacklists of over 100,000 names as officers. Camp guards, Einsatzgruppen leaders, many identified through captured documents, survivor testimonies, and aerial reconnaissance photos of camp layouts. The immediate post-surrender period saw a coordinated effort to neutralize Nazi influence. In the American zone, Military Government Directive No. 11 mandated the automatic arrest of all high-ranking SS personnel, including officers, intelligence officials, and concentration camp staff. Similar policies were enacted by the British and French. The Soviets, less concerned with legal formalities, often executed captured SS men on the spot or shipped them to labor camps in Siberia. For SS members, surrender offered no sanctuary. Many attempted to shed their identities. They burned uniforms, buried insignia, and forged discharge papers, claiming to be Wehrmacht soldiers or civilian workers. Some, like Adolf Eichmann, shaved their heads and assumed false names. Heinrich Himmler himself, now the most wanted man in Europe, tried to escape disguised as a common soldier. Captured by British forces near Bremerverde on May 21st, he bit into a hidden cyanide capsule before interrogation could begin. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, location still classified. Others were not so lucky. In Czechoslovakia, enraged, citizens lynched captured SS men in the streets of Prague following the Prague Uprising in early May. In France, former resistance fighters executed suspected Gestapo collaborators without trial. In Poland, villagers set fire to barns where retreating SS units had taken shelter. These acts of vengeance were rarely documented, but they were widespread. Yet the Allies sought something beyond revenge, a system of justice that could withstand scrutiny. That required evidence, procedure, and precedent. Hence, the decision to hold an international tribunal. The Nuremberg trials formally opened on November 20th, 1945, were not just about punishing individuals. They were a statement that organized. State-sponsored evil could not hide behind the fog of war. And at the heart of that statement was the SS. Its very existence, its ideology, its structure, its actions would be put on trial. Not as an army, but as a conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity. This legal and moral framework would determine whether an SS prisoner in 1945 spent the next decade in a re-education camp or stood on the gallows at Landsberg prison. To grasp the terrifying fate of SS prisoners after May 1945, one must view their ordeal through multiple lenses, not to excuse, but to understand the complex machinery of retribution, justice, and human frailty that shaped their final days. Human. Angle. The prisoner as perpetrator and victim. Not every SS man stood at the edge of a mass grave pulling a trigger. Some processed paperwork in Berlin. Others drove supply trucks. A few even claimed ignorance, a defense that rarely held. Yet in the eyes of survivors and liberators, such distinctions blurred. To wear the runes was to share in the guilt. Testimonies from Nuremberg reveal a spectrum of responses. Otto Ohlendorf, commander of Einsatzgruppe D, admitted to overseeing the murder of 90,000 people, yet insisted he acted out of duty. During interrogation, he spoke calmly, analytically, as though reciting logistics. In contrast, Rudolf Hess, commandant of Auschwitz, described in chilling detail the industrialized killing process, but broke down when recalling his children playing near the camp's gas chambers. For lower-ranking guards, fear often outweighed ideology. Many had been conscripted late in the war, especially into the Waffen-SS. Diaries recovered from camps show men writing home about missing their families, complaining of lice, or praying for peace. Yet these same men participated in selections, beatings, and executions. After capture, some expressed genuine remorse. Others clung to Nazi dogma until their last breath. But vulnerability cut both ways. In Allied custody, SS prisoners were often denied basic protections. At Dachau, days after liberation, U.S. soldiers executed over a dozen SS guards in what became known as the Dachau Liberation Reprisals. Though investigated, no American was ever punished. In Soviet camps, S-men were worked to death in uranium mines or Arctic labor colonies. Survival rates were abysmal. Tactical angle, fighting to the end, because surrender meant death. Waffen-SS units fought with a desperation unmatched by most Wehrmacht formations. At the Battle of Normandy, in the Falaise Pocket, SS Panzer divisions held positions long after retreat was possible. In the Ardennes offensive, SS troops disguised as Americans sowed chaos, but also invited summary execution if captured. This tenacity stemmed not from battlefield honor, but from a grim calculus. They knew what awaited them in captivity. Propaganda had painted Allied soldiers as subhuman, Jewish Bolshevik hordes. But more concretely, SS men had witnessed or committed so many atrocities that they assumed no quarter would be given. In the final weeks of the war, entire Waffen-SS divisions attempted to surrender to Western forces rather than risk capture by the Soviets. The 12th S Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, composed largely of teenage volunteers, fought fanatically in the Ruhr Pocket, then surrendered. En masse to U.S. troops in April 1945, hoping for leniency. Many were instead handed over to French authorities, where former resistance fighters meted out harsh justice. Moral angle. The Allied dilemma: soldier or criminal. Allied commanders faced an unprecedented ethical challenge. The Geneva Conventions protected lawful combatants. But could a man who guarded a gas chamber be considered a soldier? U.S. General George S. Patton, governing Bavaria in late 1945, expressed discomfort with collective punishment. "We're acting like the Nazis, we," Just defeated, he reportedly said during a visit to an overcrowded internment camp. Yet his views were overruled. SHAF, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, directives were clear. SS personnel were not to be treated as post-dot in practice. This meant exclusion from standard repatriation programs, while millions of Wehrmacht soldiers were released. By 1946, SS prisoners often remained in camps for years. Some were used for forced labor clearing rubble and bombed cities, dismantling fortifications, despite the Geneva Convention's prohibition on using posts for dangerous or punitive work. The moral ambiguity deepened when former camp guards were forced to bury victims they had helped kill. At Bergen-Belsen, British troops made SS personnel carry decomposing corpses to mass graves, sometimes at gunpoint. For survivors watching, it was catharsis. For the guards, it was humiliation mixed with terror. A few collapsed. Others wept. Most said nothing. This tension between justice and vengeance, procedure and passion, defined the early occupation. And it foreshadowed the even more complex reckoning to come at Nuremberg. In the absence of digital records, the Allies relied on analog ingenuity to identify and track SS fugitives. Captured SS personnel files many seized from the Gestapo. Headquarters in Berlin or the RSHA archives in Prague became treasure troves. Interrogation teams cross-referenced names with camp rosters. Payroll lists and even dental records. Photographic evidence proved decisive. Aerial reconnaissance photos of Auschwitz, taken by U.S. planes in 1944 during missions targeting nearby. Industrial sites were later used to map the camp's layout and identify command structures. Survivor sketches of guards, sometimes drawn from memory years later, were matched to personnel photos. The U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, pioneered early data organization. In Munich, agents compiled index cards on over 200,000 suspected war criminals. Each card noted rank, unit, last known location, and physical description. Though primitive by modern standards, this system enabled rapid identification during mass screenings of surrendering troops. One breakthrough came from the SS's own meticulousness. Himmler had insisted on exhaustive record-keeping. Birth certificates, promotion dates, even blood type. These files, recovered from a salt mine in Austria, allowed investigators to confirm identities with chilling precision. Adolf Eichmann was eventually tracked not by high-tech means, but by his wife's unmailed letters intercepted in 1950s, Argentina revealing his alias Ricardo Clement. While the Allies pursued legal accountability, ordinary citizens enacted raw, immediate vengeance. In Czechoslovakia, the Prague Uprising in early May 1945 saw civilians hunting down retreating SS and Gestapo members. Dozens were hanged from lampposts in Wenceslas Square. Photographs from the time show crowds jeering as bodies swayed in the spring wind. In Poland, villages that had lost entire families to SS reprisals meted out brutal justice. In the town of Jedwabne, though the 1941 massacre there was primarily carried out by Poles under Nazi encouragement, the post-war atmosphere still bred suspicion and violence. Former SS collaborators, real or alleged, were dragged from hiding and beaten to death. France saw its own wave of épuration savage, wild purges. An estimated 10,000 people were summarily executed by resistance fighters in the months following liberation. Many were accused of collaborating with the Gestapo or denouncing Jews. While not all were SS, the black uniform became a universal symbol of betrayal. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public, a ritual of shame that mirrored Nazi humiliation tactics. These acts were rarely sanctioned by Allied authorities, but they were often tolerated. In the chaos of 1945, Retribution from below served as both catharsis and deterrent. By April 1945, the SS leadership was disintegrating. Himmler, sensing doom, attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies through Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte. When Hitler learned of this betrayal on April 28th, he expelled Himmler from all offices and ordered his arrest. The man who once controlled Europe's terror apparatus was now a fugitive in his own Reich. Other senior SS figures followed suit. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the RSHA after Heydrich's assassination, fled to the Austrian Alps with a convoy of cars and bodyguards. Captured by U.S. troops on May 12th, he claimed ignorance of death camps, a lie dismantled by documentary evidence at Nuremberg. But the most telling collapse was ideological. SS units that had once prided themselves on ideological purity now scrambled for survival. Some Waffen's divisions in Italy even approached Allied lines under white flags, offering intelligence on Soviet movements in exchange for protection, a transactional plea that revealed the hollowness of their nightly myth. In the end, the SS's fate was sealed not only by its crimes, but by its own leaders' abandonment of the cause. When Himmler chose cyanide over captivity, he left his followers without direction, without redemption, and without mercy. This unraveling of structure, identity, and command set the stage for the moment when justice, formal, legal, and global, would finally be delivered. In the spring of 1945, the machinery of retribution began to turn not with the slow deliberation of courts, but with the raw immediacy of liberation. The first encounters between Allied troops and SS prisoners were not governed by law, but by what men had seen, smelled, and felt in the camps they liberated. And what they had seen defied comprehension. On April 29, 1945, troops of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division reached Dachau. What they found behind the electrified fences was not a prison, but a charnel house. Over 30,000 emaciated prisoners, many near death, crowded into barracks designed for 6,000. Train cars sat on a siding, filled with 2,310 corpses, their skin stretched tight over bone, limbs frozen in rigor mortis. The stench of decay hung in the air like a physical presence. Inside the camp, the Americans discovered SS guards still at their posts. Some attempted to flee. Others surrendered meekly. A few stood motionless, as if expecting what came next. It came swiftly. In the hours following liberation, U.S. soldiers executed at least 17 SS personnel. Some lined up against a wall near the coal yard. Others shot in the watchtowers. Lieutenant Howard Buchner, the division's medical officer, later wrote that the sight of the dead in the boxcars triggered a kind of madness. Major General Felix Sparks, commander of the 157th Infantry Regiment, recalled trying to stop the killings. I fired my pistol in the air, but no one listened. The Dachau reprisal was not an isolated incident. At Buchenwald, U.S. troops forced local German civilians to tour the camp, then made SS guards bury the dead with their bare hands. In Mauthausen, Austrian survivors tore SS men from American custody and beat them to death with rocks. These acts were not officially sanctioned, but they were rarely punished. The U.S. Army conducted an investigation into the Dachau shootings, but General George S. Patton, then military governor of Bavaria, blocked any prosecutions, calling the guards less than animals. The report was buried for decades. Yet, even as spontaneous violence flared, a more systematic process was unfolding. On May 1, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, the U.S. War Department issued Directive JCS 1067, which classified all SS personnel, regardless of rank or role, as Category I suspects, automatic arrestees. This policy was mirrored by British and French authorities. The screening began at collection points across Germany. At Dustbin in Frankfurt and Ashcan in Luxembourg, suspected war criminals were interrogated under bright lights, often sleep-deprived, sometimes threatened with Soviet custody. Interrogators used psychological pressure more than physical force. We know you were a Treblinka. Your name is on the gate log. One of the first major captures was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Himmler's successor as head of the RSHA, found hiding in a mountain lodge in Altaussee, Austria. He was flown to Luxembourg for questioning. There, despite his denials, Allied investigators matched his fingerprints to documents ordering mass executions in the East, but the most symbolically significant arrest occurred on May 23, 1945, in Flensburg. British troops surrounded a convoy of vehicles linked to Dönitz's rump government. Among the detainees was Karl Dönitz himself, and, more crucially, Albert Speer, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Heinrich Himmler's former deputy, SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Keitel. Though Keitel was Wehrmacht, his close collaboration with the SS made him a prime target. By June, over 100,000 SS members had been detained. Many were held in former POW camps, now repurposed as internment centers. Conditions varied. In use run. Camps like Dachau, ironically reused as Camp No. 7. Prisoners received Red Cross parcels and medical care, though overcrowding and poor sanitation led to outbreaks of dysentery. In Soviet camps, mortality rates approached 50%, yet the Allies knew that summary justice, however emotionally satisfying, would not suffice. The world demanded a reckoning that transcended vengeance, a trial that would document, expose, and condemn the Nazi system in full public view. That vision crystallized in a quiet decision made in London on August 8, 1945. Representatives of the United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and France signed the London Charter, establishing the International Military Tribunal. Its purpose: to prosecute major war criminals whose offenses had no geographical limits, and at the top of the indictment listed as Organization No. 1 was the Schutzstaffel. The stage was set, not in a forest clearing or a prison yard, but in a courtroom in Nuremberg, a medieval city chosen for its symbolic resonance and its intact palace of justice. The SS would not just be punished. It would be dissected, exposed, and declared criminal in the eyes of history. The courtroom in Nuremberg's Palace of Justice was bathed in cold November light on November 20th, 1945. Behind a row of bulletproof glass sat 21 of the Third Reich's highest-ranking officials. Among them, Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Albert Speer, and 6 senior SS officers, including Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the RSHA, and Oswald Pohl, who oversaw the SS economic empire. But the true defendant, in many ways, was not a person. It was the SS itself. On November 28, 1945, the prosecution delivered its opening statement against the SS as a collective entity. U.S. Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson stood before the tribunal and declared the SS was the elite organization of the Nazi state. It was the instrument by which the Nazi regime carried out its most infamous crimes. He laid out evidence gathered from camp records, Einsatzgruppen reports, and captured SS correspondence documents that showed systematic participation in genocide, enslavement, and torture. The defense argued that the SS was not monolithic, that the Waffen-SS were soldiers, the Allgemein-SS administrative clerks, and only a small fraction directly involved in atrocities. But the tribunal had already anticipated this. Article 9 of the London Charter allowed the prosecution to declare entire organizations criminal, thereby enabling future national courts to convict individual members without retrial of the organization's guilt. Over weeks of testimony, the scale of SS complicity became undeniable. Rudolf Hess, former commandant of Auschwitz, took the stand on April 15, 1946. Calm, precise, he described the extermination process with bureaucratic detachment. We estimated that 2.5 million people were executed and exterminated in Auschwitz through gassing and burning. He detailed the selection ramps, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the gold teeth melted into ingots. When asked if he ever felt remorse, he replied, "Not at the time. I was obeying orders." The Einsatzgruppen trial, held separately in 1947 to 1948, further cemented the SS's criminal identity. Otto Ohlendorf, once proud of his unit's efficiency, now admitted under cross-examination that his men had shot women and children because the Führer believed Jewish children would grow up to be avengers. On September 30, 1946, the International Military Tribunal delivered its verdict. The SS was declared a criminal organization. So were the Gestapo and SD. The Waffen-SS, the tribunal ruled, was so thoroughly implicated in the commission of crimes that it cannot be dissociated from the criminal acts of the SS as a whole. The implications were seismic. Membership alone after 1939, with knowledge of its criminal purpose, could now be grounds for prosecution anywhere in the world. For the individual defendants, the consequences were immediate. 10 were sentenced to death by hanging. Among them, Kaltenbrunner, Pohl, and Julius Streicher. Though the latter was not SS, his propaganda had fueled their ideology. Gring committed suicide the night before execution. The hangings took place in the early hours of October 16, 1946, in a gymnasium at Nuremberg prison. The gallows had been hastily constructed. The ropes were standard-issue U.S. Army hemp. Each man was weighed the night before to calibrate the drop dot as Kaltenbrunner ascended the steps. He reportedly whispered, "I have nothing to atone for." Moments later, the trapdoor opened, but Nuremberg was only the beginning. The tribunal's declaration against the SS unleashed a wave of prosecutions across Europe. In Poland, SS guards from Majdanek and Treblinka were tried and executed. In France, Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was sentenced to death in absentia. He would not be captured until 1983. In Czechoslovakia, the commander of the Litis massacre was hanged in 1947, yet thousands remained at large. Many had vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe, aided by Catholic clerics, fascist sympathizers, and even intelligence agencies seeking Cold War assets. The SS's final act of survival was not in battle, but in flight, and as the Hammond's noose tightened on Nuremberg's condemned, another fate awaited those who escaped, decades in hiding, hunted not by armies, but by memory. In the years immediately following the Nuremberg verdicts, the fate of SS prisoners diverged along 3 stark paths: execution, internment, or disappearance. For those captured and identified, the post-war world offered little refuge. Allied denazification programs, launched across Germany in 1946, categorized citizens into 5 groups: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. SS members, especially officers, camp personnel, and SD agents, were automatically placed in the top 2 categories. Over 180,000 former SS personnel passed through internment camps by 1948. Dachau, Buchenwald, and Flossenburg once sites of Nazi terror were now repurposed as Allied detention centers, their guard towers manned by U.S. or French soldiers. Conditions varied widely. In American-run camps, detainees received food rations, access to basic medical care, and, after 1947, visits from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Yet overcrowding, poor sanitation, and psychological strain took a toll. Suicide rates were alarmingly high. At Camp Dachau alone, Over 200 former SS men took their own lives between 1945 and 1948, many by hanging themselves with bedsheets or swallowing smuggled poison dot in the Soviet zone. The fate of SS prisoners was far grimmer. The NKVD classified them as especially dangerous fascist elements. Thousands were transported to special camps like Sachsenhausen, now NKVD Special Camp No. 7, or Bautzen, where death rates from starvation, typhus, and forced labor exceeded 30%. Few ever returned. Soviet records, declassified decades later, show that of the estimated 60,000 SS members captured by the Red Army, fewer than 10,000 survived their captivity. But for those who evaded capture, the post-war landscape offered unexpected avenues of escape. As early as 1946, underground networks, later dubbed ratlines, began funneling fugitive Nazis out of Europe. The most infamous route ran through Rome, where sympathetic Catholic clergy, including Austrian Bishop Alois Hudel, provided false baptismal certificates, Red Cross passports, and ship passage to Argentina, Syria, or Egypt. The Vatican, though officially neutral, turned a blind eye. Documents released in 2020 from the Vatican Apostolic Archive confirmed that Pope Pius XII's administration was aware of these operations. The motivation was not ideological sympathy alone, but Cold War pragmatism. Former SS intelligence officers were seen as valuable assets against communism. Among the first to vanish was Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's logistics. After hiding in Germany under the alias Otto Eckmann, he fled to Argentina in 1950 with the help of a ratline organized by former SS officer Otto Skorzeny. There, he lived quietly as a mechanic until Israeli Mossad agents captured him in 1960. Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz Angel of Death, followed a similar path. After working on a farm in Bavaria under a false name, he slipped into Italy in 1949, then sailed to Buenos Aires, protected by wealthy German expatriates and shielded by Argentina's Peronist government. He evaded capture for decades, dying of a stroke in Brazil in 1979, never brought to justice. Klaus Barbie, head of the Gestapo in Lyon, found refuge in Bolivia with covert assistance from U.S. intelligence. In 1947, the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, employed him to spy on communists in post-war Europe. When French authorities demanded his extradition, American agents helped him flee to South America via Genoa. He would not face trial until 1987. When he was finally extradited to France and sentenced to life imprisonment. Even high-ranking ideologues found sanctuary. Gustav Wagner, deputy commandant of Sober extermination camp, lived openly in Brazil under his real name until his suspicious death in 1980. Franz Stangl, commandant of Sobibor and Treblinka, was arrested in Brazil in 1967 and died in prison. One day after testifying in his own trial, what enabled these escapes was not just corruption or sympathy, but systemic failure. In the rush to rebuild Europe, denazification waned by 1948. West Germany, eager to stabilize its new democracy, reintegrated thousands of former Nazis into civil service, intelligence, and industry. The SS man, who once compiled lists of Jews for deportation, now worked in a municipal tax office, his past quietly overlooked. Meanwhile, the psychological weight of captivity bore down on those who remained. In West German prisons, former SS officers formed cliques, exchanged coded letters, and clung to fragments of their old ideology. Some expressed remorse, most did not. During interviews conducted in the 1950s by historian Golo Mann, several insisted they had only followed orders, or claimed they knew nothing of the death camps, a narrative that would dominate German public discourse for a generation. Yet the world had changed. The SS was no longer an army. It was a stain. And for those who bore its mark, even survival came at the cost of living in shadows, forever looking over their shoulders, forever. Haunted not just by what they had done, but by the certainty that someone, somewhere, remembered. The long shadow of the SS extended far beyond the prison walls and rattling escape routes. In the decades after 1945, the fate of its members became entangled with the evolving conscience of Germany. The mechanisms of international justice, and the unresolved trauma of survivors died in West Germany. The early post-war years saw a troubling pattern of institutional amnesia. Though the Nuremberg Tribunal had declared the SS a criminal organization, domestic courts moved slowly. Between 1945 and 1950, over 5,000 former SS members stood trial in German courts, but convictions were rare, sentences lenient. Judges and prosecutors, many of whom had served under the Nazi regime, often sympathized with defendants. A turning point came in 1958 with the establishment of the Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the investigation of national socialist crimes in Ludwigsburg. For the first time, West Germany committed to systematically tracking down and prosecuting former SS personnel. The office, staffed by a small team of dedicated jurists, began compiling dossiers on over 170,000 suspects. Their breakthrough came with the 1963-1965 Frankfurt Auschwitz Trials. Unlike Nuremberg, which focused on leadership, Frankfurt prosecuted mid- and lower-level SS camp staff, not for membership in a criminal organization, but for individual acts of murder. 22 defendants stood in the courtroom, including camp doctors, block leaders, and guards. The trial shocked the German public. Survivors like Hermann Lambein and Philipp Müller gave harrowing testimony about selections, medical experiments, and daily brutality. Yet many defendants claimed they were just doing their job. One former guard insisted he had never personally killed anyone, only opened the gas chamber doors. The court convicted 17, but none received the death penalty. Most were sentenced to 3 to 14 years, many of which were reduced on appeal. Public reaction was mixed. Some saw justice. Others saw leniency. But for historians, the trial marked a shift. German society was finally confronting its complicity in East Germany. The narrative was simpler but less honest. The communist regime portrayed all Nazis as tools of Western capitalism, claiming the GDR had eradicated fascism. Former SS members who remained in the East were often imprisoned without trial or forced into labor battalions. Yet some, particularly those with technical skills, were quietly reintegrated so long as they pledged loyalty to the state. Meanwhile, international efforts to hold fugitives accountable intensified. In 1960, Israel's capture of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires electrified the world. His trial in Jerusalem, broadcast globally, forced a new generation to confront the mechanics of genocide. Eichmann's defense that he was a mere bureaucrat crumbled under prosecutor Gideon Hausner's relentless questioning. "You transported children to their deaths," Hausner said. "Was that also just paperwork?" Eichmann was hanged on May 31, 1962, the only judicial execution in Israeli history. Other hunts continued. In 1971, Erich Priebke, SS captain responsible for the Ardeatine Caves massacre in Rome, where 335 Italian civilians were executed in retaliation for a partisan attack, was identified living in Argentina. Extradited to Italy in 1995, he was convicted but placed under house arrest due to his age. He died in 2013, unrepentant. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of impunity was Joseph Mendel. Despite global manhunts, he lived freely in Paraguay and Brazil under his real name. West German authorities issued an arrest warrant in 1959, but failed to share critical intelligence with Israeli or Brazilian investigators. Declassified documents later revealed that the BND, West Germany's intelligence agency, knew Mengeles' location as early as 1960, but chose not to act, fearing diplomatic fallout. The psychological toll on both perpetrators and victims lingered for generations. In the 1980s, psychologists studying former SS men noted a pattern of emotional detachment, denial, and, in rare cases, late-onset guilt. One former guard, interviewed in 1987, broke down when shown a photograph of a child he had marched to the gas chamber. "I didn't think of them as people," he whispered. "Just numbers." For survivors, the sight of unprosecuted SS men walking free in German towns was a wound that never healed. Elie Wiesel wrote that the greatest sadness is not the cruelty of the killer, but the silence of the world. Yet from this silence emerged a new legal framework. The Nuremberg precedent that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity regardless of national law became the foundation for the International Criminal Court, the tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia and modern war. Crimes prosecutions. The SS, once a symbol of absolute power, became a cautionary emblem of how ideology, bureaucracy, and obedience can converge into industrialized evil. And for those who wore its runes, the collapse of the Third Reich did not bring peace. It brought reckoning, sometimes swift, often delayed, but never truly escaped. In the quiet of a Munich archive in 2015, a researcher uncovered a faded photograph. It showed a group of SS officers at a summer retreat in 1942 smiling, relaxed, holding beer steins under chestnut trees. One man, barely 30, stood slightly apart, his eyes distant. His name was Hans Kruger. 2 years later, as SS commander in occupied Poland, he oversaw the massacre of over 3,000 Jews in the Stanisław marketplace. After the war, he vanished only to resurface in West Germany in the 1950s as a respected judge. He was finally arrested in 1958, tried, and sentenced to life. He died in prison in 1988. This duality, the man in the photograph and the man in the courtroom, captures the haunting paradox of the SS. They were not monsters in the mythic sense. They were bureaucrats, fathers, intellectuals, farmers. They listened to Wagner, read Goethe, kissed their children goodnight. And then they organized. Trains to death camps. The terrifying fate of SS prisoners after 1945 was not merely about punishment. It was about the world's desperate attempt to reconcile the ordinary with the unspeakable. How does a society punish men who committed crimes so vast they shattered the very language of justice? How do you try a system designed to erase its victims from history? The Allies' answer was imperfect. Some SS men were executed without trial. Others lived in comfort, shielded by silence or Cold War alliances. Many slipped through the cracks, their crimes buried beneath new names and quiet lives. Yet in choosing Nuremberg over vengeance, the victors made a profound statement that even in the ruins of civilization, law must prevail over bloodlust. That choice reshaped the modern world. The concept of crimes against humanity, born in the courtroom at Nuremberg, now underpins international law. The principle that following orders is no defense has been invoked from Rwanda to The Hague. The very idea that an organization can be declared criminal has deterred. However, imperfectly, the rise of new ideological killing machines. But the deeper legacy lies in memory. The SS sought to annihilate not just people, but evidence-burning bodies, shredding records, silencing witnesses. The survivors, the liberators, the prosecutors, and even the prisoners themselves became unwilling archivists of that truth. Every testimony, every photograph, every recovered document was an act of resistance against oblivion. Today, as the last witnesses fade, the fate of the SS serves as a warning encoded in history. Evil rarely announces itself in uniforms of black. It wears the mask of duty. It hides in paperwork. It thrives in silence. And justice real. Enduring justice is not a single verdict, but a continuous act of remembrance. In the forests of Bavaria, where SS men once marched to war, wildflowers now grow through the rusted tracks of tanks. At Dachau, schoolchildren walk the same paths once trod by the condemned, stopping to read names etched in stone. There are no statues to the SS, no memorials, only absence, and in that absence, a question echoes not of vengeance, but of vigilance. What will we recognize, and what will we refuse to see when the next ideology of hate dons the mask of order? The answer lies not in the fate of the SS, but in ours.